Welcome to Power Profile Channel. Please subscribe, like, and share for more content.
Later condemned as a dictator. Robert Mugabe divided a nation and the world. Was he a hero who freed Zimbabwe or a tyrant who destroyed it? Few political figures in modern African history embody such stark contradictions as Robert Mugabe. His story is one of remarkable transformation, from teacher to revolutionary, from freedom fighter to authoritarian ruler. Born in 1924 in what was then southern Rhodesia, Robert Mugabe was a top student. The son of a carpenter, he grew up under British colonial rule, where the white minority held power, while the black majority faced systematic discrimination. Education became his pathway forward. Intellectually gifted, Mugabe earned multiple degrees and was inspired by African independence movements while studying abroad in Ghana. Ghana's success under Kwame Nkrumah showed him what was possible, a future where Africans governed themselves. Upon returning to southern Rhodesia, Mugabe found a political landscape increasingly defined by resistance to colonial rule.
And Mugabe, with his intellectual credentials, was well positioned to join this movement. In the 1960s, he joined the fight against British colonial rule and white minority government. The struggle for independence in southern Rhodesia was particularly difficult. While other African nations were gaining freedom through negotiated transitions, the white minority government of Ian Smith was determined to maintain power. Mugabe co-founded ZANU and led a bloody liberation war. His decision to embrace armed struggle wasn't taken lightly, but reflected the reality that peaceful paths to majority rule had been systematically blocked. The Rhodesian Bush War was a brutal guerrilla conflict. ZANU fighters, trained in neighboring countries and supported by communist nations, waged a campaign of sabotage and rural insurgency. The government responded with harsh counterinsurgency tactics. For his part in organizing resistance, Mugabe was imprisoned for 10 years. His incarceration only strengthened his resolve and elevated his status. In prison, he continued his education and refined his political philosophy. After years of guerrilla warfare and imprisonment, the war ended. When the votes were counted in 1980, Zimbabwe was born, and Mugabe became its first prime minister. At first, he was a national hero. The world watched with optimism as Mugabe took office. His inaugural address surprised many with its conciliatory tone. Despite the bitter struggle that had preceded independence, Mugabe called for reconciliation between black and white Zimbabweans and urged white citizens to remain in the country. He protected property rights and maintained economic stability during the transition. His government invested in education and healthcare, making Zimbabwe one of Africa's most literate countries. New clinics were built in rural areas previously neglected under colonial rule. Agricultural production increased, and Zimbabwe became known as the breadbasket of Africa. International aid flowed in, and Western nations held up Zimbabwe as a model of post-colonial transition. Mugabe himself was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 1994. But beneath this promising surface, troubling patterns were emerging. Between 1983 and 1987, government forces carried out a campaign of violence in Matabeleland, killing thousands of civilians. But in the 2000s, things changed. Facing growing opposition and economic challenges, Mugabe turned to increasingly desperate policies. The catalyst was land reform, a legitimate issue in a country where the white minority still owned most of the fertile farmland decades after independence. Mugabe ordered violent land seizures from white farmers. What might have been an orderly redistribution became chaotic and brutal. Productive farms were handed to political allies with little agricultural experience. This triggered an economic collapse, food shortages, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. The government responded by printing money, leading to hyperinflation that reached absurd levels. At one point, prices were doubling every 24 hours. Millions of Zimbabweans fled the country, creating a diaspora across southern Africa and beyond. A cholera epidemic spread through communities lacking clean water and functioning healthcare systems. He clung to power through violent crackdowns and rigged elections. The movement for democratic change, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, posed the most serious challenge to Mugabe's rule. Tsvangirai was beaten, imprisoned, and forced to withdraw from a presidential runoff in 2008 due to violence against his supporters. Once the pride of Africa, Zimbabwe became a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale of how liberation credentials could be used to justify it. In 2017, after 37 years in power, Mugabe was forced to resign by the military. The man who had dominated Zimbabwe for nearly 4 decades was finally removed, not by the ballot box, but by his own allies who feared he was preparing to install his wife, Grace, as his successor. When the news broke, Zimbabweans celebrated in the streets, but the system Mugabe had built remained largely intact. His former vice president and enforcer, Emerson Mnangagwa, took power, promising reforms, but delivering more of the same authoritarian governance. 2 years later, he died in exile at age 95, receiving medical treatment in Singapore, while the country he had ruled couldn't provide basic health care to its citizens. To some, he'll always be a freedom fighter who stood against imperialism. To others, a dictator who ruined a nation. Robert Mugabe, liberation hero, or tyrant. Perhaps he was both, a man whose greatest strengths became his fatal flaws, whose righteous cause was corrupted by the very power he fought to obtain. Zimbabwe continues to struggle with Mugabe's complicated legacy, even as it searches for a path forward. History will likely judge him harshly, but with the nuance his complex story demands, acknowledging both the promise of his beginning and the tragedy of his end.
Don't forget subscribe, like, share to Power Profile channel. For more content.